History does not collapse because it is wrong. It collapses because it is incomplete. For decades, official science, school textbooks, and geopolitical models have treated Venezuela as a failed state, an economy mismanaged, a nation undone by corruption and ideology. The data is presented cleanly, simplified, domesticated. What is rarely addressed is not why Venezuela fell, but why it mattered so much that it did. Beneath its soil lie forces that do not fit comfortably into modern narratives. Oils that refuse to behave like oil. Metals that decide the fate of digital empires. Minerals that quietly underpin aerospace. Weapon systems, and energy transitions that have not yet fully arrived. Deposits mapped, then unmapped. Quantities acknowledged, then softened. Entire regions classified, then forgotten. If this land holds resources powerful enough to distort global markets, destabilize governments, and invite intervention without invasion, then why is it consistently described as peripheral? Why do strategic doctrines circle it in silence? Why do sanctions arrive faster than solutions? And why does every attempt to exploit its depths seem to end not in prosperity, but in collapse? What follows is not a story about wealth. It is a warning about thresholds humanity crossed without understanding what it was extracting, and what those resources would eventually demand in return. The camera opens over a flat, humid horizon. No towering rigs, no dramatic flames, just land that looks inert, almost indifferent. This is the Orinoco Belt, and beneath it lies oil that should not exist in this form. What Venezuela possesses here is not conventional crude. It is extra heavy and ultra heavy oil, so dense it barely flows, so complex it resists the very definition of petroleum. In raw form, it behaves less like a liquid and more like a geological memory, trapped halfway between solid and fluid. By volume alone, the Orinoco Belt contains the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than any single nation officially recognized as an energy superpower. This is not speculation. It is not an estimate inflated by politics. It is a figure repeatedly confirmed, measured, and quietly accepted. Yet this oil comes with a condition. It cannot be pumped easily. It cannot be refined conventionally. To extract it, one must heat it, dilute it, upgrade it, forcing it to behave like something it is not. Every barrel demands technology, infrastructure, and energy investment far beyond standard oil fields. In other words, the Orinoco Belt does not reward haste. It punishes it. Official explanations stop here. Heavy oil is expensive. Market volatility makes it risky. Environmental costs are high. Venezuela lacked capital and expertise. These reasons are technically correct and fundamentally insufficient. Because countries do not ignore the largest energy reserve on the planet, simply because it is inconvenient. What makes the Orinoco Belt truly anomalous is not its size, but its timing. As global energy systems move toward light, flexible fuels, easy to ship, easy to refine, Venezuela's oil represented the opposite future: centralized, capital-intensive, and technologically unforgiving. Control of this resource does not empower small players. It favors states, alliances, and long-term planners willing to think in decades rather than election cycles. And this is where the logic begins to fracture. If the Orinoco Belt is a liability, why has it been the subject of sustained foreign interest for over a century? Why were early extraction experiments conducted long before heavy oil was commercially viable? Why were upgrading technologies developed in parallel with geopolitical pressure rather than market demand? And why, once Venezuela attempted to assert sovereign control over this resource, did financial isolation accelerate instead of recede? The standard narrative claims mismanagement collapsed production. the data tells a more uncomfortable story. Production capacity did not merely decline. It was rendered strategically unusable. Heavy oil is not just fuel, it is leverage. Whoever controls its processing chain controls whether the resource exists at all. Cut access to diluents, spare parts, software systems, or financing, and the oil returns to silence, locked beneath the ground, legally owned yet practically unreachable. In this sense, the Orinoco Belt exposes a fault line in modern resource theory. Ownership is no longer enough. Extraction requires permission from systems that exist beyond borders, technology standards, financial clearinghouses, energy certification regimes. Venezuela possessed the oil, but not the full stack required to activate it independently. The unresolved question is not why Venezuela failed to capitalize on its oil. The question is why a resource of this magnitude appears almost designed to collapse nations that rely on it prematurely. Because heavy oil forces a choice. Either integrate fully into global systems of control, or attempt autonomy at extraordinary cost. Venezuela attempted the latter, before the world was willing to tolerate it. And so the Orinoco Belt remains mostly intact, not exhausted, not depleted, simply dormant. A reserve so large it could reshape global energy balances, yet so constrained that activating it destabilizes the very structures meant to manage it. The official explanation ends with economics, but the fracture suggests something deeper. What kind of resource delivers power only after total dependence is accepted, and punishment the moment autonomy is attempted? That question does not belong to Venezuela alone. The scene opens in silence, dense forest, red earth, a river that carries more sediment than reflection. There are no fences here, no warning signs, only absence, where something vast was meant to be. Las Cristinas is not a rumor. It is not a speculative strike or an exaggerated frontier claim. It is one of the largest undeveloped gold deposits ever identified, containing tens of millions of ounces of high-grade ore, concentrated within a relatively accessible geological formation. The kind of deposit that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been transformed into a flagship national project decades ago. This did not happen. What exists instead is a site frozen in perpetual anticipation, surveyed, mapped, litigated, remapped, and abandoned again. A gold reserve so well documented that its absence from global production statistics is itself an anomaly. Gold, unlike oil, does not require complex upgrading chains. It does not depend on proprietary software or foreign dilution agents. It can be extracted, refined, and stored by states with far fewer technological dependencies, which makes the paralysis surrounding Las Cristinas difficult to justify. Officially, the explanations are procedural: contract disputes, environmental concerns, regulatory instability, international arbitration. Each explanation is plausible in isolation. Together, they form a pattern of delay so consistent, it begins to resemble containment rather than failure. Because gold is not merely a commodity, it is a monetary instrument. And monetary instruments threaten systems when they exist outside controlled channels. At multiple points, foreign mining corporations secured rights to Las Cristinas, only to see projects collapse under legal pressure, shifting policy, or sudden withdrawal of financial backing. When Venezuela attempted to reassert control, the mine did not stabilize. It vanished into a fog of sanctions, lawsuits, and stalled feasibility studies. What followed was more revealing than what came before. As formal development halted, informal extraction surged. Illegal mining operations proliferated across the region, moving gold through unregulated networks, bypassing global reporting mechanisms entirely. The gold did not disappear. It simply exited the system designed to track it. This is where the logic breaks. If environmental protection were the true priority, why allow uncontrolled artisanal mining to replace regulated industrial extraction? If governance were the obstacle, why did every attempt at stabilization trigger further isolation? And if Las Cristinas were merely an economic asset, why has its activation repeatedly coincided with international legal escalation rather than investment? The standard explanation frames Venezuela as incapable of managing its own wealth. But Las Cristinas suggests a different tension: gold that cannot be safely integrated into modern financial order without destabilizing it. Large, sovereign-controlled gold reserves challenge fiat confidence. They complicate debt structures. They introduce alternatives to currency systems built on trust rather than backing. For states under sanction or financial pressure, gold represents an exit: slow, heavy, but real. Las Cristinas, if operational at scale, would not simply enrich Venezuela. It would alter its negotiating position. And that, historically, is when pressure intensifies. The mine's continued dormancy raises an uncomfortable possibility that some resources are more dangerous above ground than below it. That extraction is not delayed because it is impossible, but because it is strategically intolerable under current conditions. Today, Las Cristinas remains officially undeveloped, yet satellite imagery shows scars. Rivers carry traces. Gold continues to leave the region without entering ledgers or reserves. A deposit large enough to anchor monetary independence has been fragmented into invisibility, and so the question remains unresolved. Why does one of the world's richest gold deposits exist in a permanent state of suspension? Neither exploited nor protected, neither acknowledged nor erased. And what does it mean when gold becomes too disruptive to be mined openly? That question will matter far beyond Venezuela. The camera descends through cloud cover onto a landscape that appears untouched. Dense rainforest, ancient rock, rivers cutting paths older than memory. This is the Guayana region, one of the oldest exposed geological formations on Earth. And beneath it lies a material that modern civilization cannot function without, yet rarely acknowledges by name. Coltan is not a metal. It is a contradiction. Short for columbite tantalite, coltan is the primary source of tantalum, a mineral essential for high capacitance, heat-resistant components used in smartphones, satellites, guided missiles, medical implants, and secure communication systems. Without it, miniaturization fails, reliability collapses, precision becomes theoretical. Venezuela's coltan reserves are real. Mapped in the southern Guayana Shield, they sit within cratonic rock formations comparable to those in Central Africa, where coltan reshaped entire regions through conflict, militarization, and shadow economies. Geological surveys have confirmed their presence. What has never been clarified is their full extent. Officially, Venezuela is described as a minor or emerging coltan holder. Unofficially, military zones were established around deposits long before public acknowledgement. Extraction was classified. Data was fragmented. Production figures, when released, appeared inconsistent with observed activity on the ground. This is where certainty gives way to discomfort. Unlike oil or gold, coltan does not generate wealth through volume. It generates power through control. Small quantities can sustain entire technological supply chains, and disruptions, intentional or accidental, propagate instantly through global manufacturing systems, which is why coltan does not tolerate transparency. In the Guayana region, access to coltan zones has repeatedly been restricted under the language of environmental protection and national security. Yet illegal mining networks operate openly along river corridors, extracting ore under conditions that evade both regulation and reporting. The mineral flows outward, not through ports or contracts, but through routes designed to leave no trace. The official explanation focuses on governance challenges and remote terrain. But this explanation collapses under scale, because controlling coltan does not require mass infrastructure. It requires surveillance, logistics, and quiet agreements. And those systems, in Venezuela, were established early. The deeper fracture lies in how coltan intersects with sovereignty. A state that controls tantalum supply holds leverage over industries it does not publicly confront. Aerospace, defense electronics, encryption hardware, medical technology. These are not markets that tolerate uncertainty from outside approved frameworks. When Venezuela announced coltan discoveries, the response was not investment. It was caution. No rush of international partnerships. No transparent supply integration. Instead, there was silence, followed by sanctions that, while unrelated on paper, severed the very channels required to formalize coltan trade. What emerged was a parallel economy. Coltan, leaving without invoices, without customs records, without acknowledgement that it ever existed. This is not inefficiency, it is containment. Because coltan is not just extracted, it is licensed, implicitly, by systems that decide who may participate in advanced technological production and who may not. Venezuela's deposits represented an uncontrolled variable in a tightly managed global equation. The unresolved question is not whether Venezuela has coltan. That has been established. The question is why a mineral essential to modern warfare and digital life is allowed to flow only when it remains invisible, and why every attempt to formalize its existence inside Venezuela coincides with deeper isolation rather than integration. In the Guayana Shield, the rock is ancient, the minerals are modern, and the conflict they generate does not announce itself with armies, but with absences. What happens when the materials that define the future are buried in places the system cannot fully control? That question, once asked, does not remain local. The scene opens over moving water. Dark, fast, indifferent. The Caroni River cuts through the Guayana Shield with the weight of the deep time, carrying sediments eroded from some of the oldest rock on the planet. In those sediments lie diamonds, not arranged in neat kimberlite pipes, but scattered, displaced, and resistant to prediction. This is not the kind of diamond story the world is accustomed to. The diamonds of the Caroni Basin are alluvial, transported by rivers, buried and reburied over millions of years, detached from their original volcanic sources. They appear where geology says they should not, and disappear where models insist they must be present. For industrial planning, this is a nightmare. For informal extraction, it is ideal. Venezuela has long been recognized as a diamond-bearing country. What is less acknowledged is the quality and strategic character of these stones. They are not primarily gemstones. They are industrial-grade diamonds, hard, irregular, and exceptionally suited for cutting tools, precision drilling, aerospace machining, and advanced optics. In other words, they serve systems, not symbols. Official records list modest production. Field reports tell a different story. Throughout the Caroni Basin, diamond extraction has operated in a gray zone for decades. Mining camps appear and vanish. Output fluctuates without correlation to reported activity. Entire flows of stones bypass formal markets, moving through intermediaries that specialize in anonymity rather than efficiency. The standard explanation is familiar. Remote terrain, weak enforcement, environmental degradation. These factors are real. They are also incomplete. Because diamonds, like coltan, are not dangerous due to abundance, but due to utility. Industrial diamonds are inputs for industries that define technological superiority. They are consumed, not displayed, and their demand does not fluctuate with fashion or sentiment, which is why regulation around them is unusually strict. International diamond frameworks focus on conflict prevention, certification, and traceability. On paper, these systems promote transparency. In practice, they determine which diamonds are allowed to exist inside the global supply chain, and which are rendered invisible by default. Venezuela's position inside these frameworks has been unstable, at times suspended, at times readmitted under conditions that limited export legitimacy without fully prohibiting extraction. The result was predictable. Diamonds continued to move, but not through official channels. This creates a contradiction the official narrative cannot resolve. If the goal were to prevent illicit trade, isolating formal markets would achieve the opposite. If environmental protection were central, uncontrolled extraction would be intolerable. Yet the system tolerated both outcomes simultaneously, which suggests a different priority. Industrial diamonds from the Caroni Basin do not destabilize markets through volume. They destabilize them by offering alternatives, sources not fully integrated into pricing, tracking, or strategic allocation systems dominated by a small number of actors. A state with autonomous access to such materials gains quiet leverage, not through spectacle but through capability. The Caroni diamonds were never meant to be a showcase resource. They were meant to be usable, and that usability made them inconvenient. Today, official statistics describe decline. Satellite imagery suggests continuity. The river keeps moving. Sediment keeps shifting. Diamonds keep surfacing, then leaving, without records that match their trajectory. The unresolved question is not whether Venezuela has diamonds. It is why their most valuable function has been systematically separated from formal acknowledgement. When a resource essential to high-precision industry is allowed to exist only in shadow, the shadow itself becomes the system. And once that happens, control no longer depends on extraction. It depends on silence. The opening shot is aerial. A vast plateau stretches to the horizon, flat, oxidized, scarred in quiet geometries of red and rust. No drama, no movement, just exposure. This is the Guayana Highlands, where the land itself announces what it contains. Bauxite does not glitter. It does not flow. It does not invite attention. And yet, without it, modern industrial civilization collapses. Bauxite is the primary source of aluminum, a metal that defines lightweight strength, aircraft frames, power transmission, space launch systems, armored vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure. Aluminum is not rare, but strategic-grade bauxite is. And Venezuela's reserves sit on one of the most stable cratonic formations on Earth. Geologically, the Guayana Shield is ideal, ancient, chemically weathered, thick lateritic layers enriched over tens of millions of years. The kind of formation that produces high-purity bauxite with low processing penalties. This is not contested. It has been surveyed repeatedly. What is contested is why these deposits never became central to global aluminum supply chains. Official explanations focus on economics, falling prices, infrastructure decay, competition from Australia, Guinea, and Brazil. Each explanation holds on paper. Together, they fail to explain the persistence of foreign interest long after production slowed, and the strategic anxiety that followed any attempt to revive it. Because aluminum is not just a metal, it is a multiplier. Access to aluminum determines whether a state can build independently at scale. Aircraft without reliance on foreign alloys, electrical grids without imported conductors, military platforms without outsourced materials, science. Control over aluminum production is control over industrial autonomy. Venezuela once possessed that autonomy. At its peak, the Guayana region hosted integrated aluminum complexes, mines, refineries, smelters, linked to hydroelectric power from the Caroni River. It was a closed loop. Ore to metal to export, rare in the global south, and strategically uncomfortable. The system did not collapse overnight. It was dismantled gradually. Maintenance contracts lapsed. Spare parts became unavailable. Energy inputs grew unstable. International partnerships withdrew not because the ore vanished, but because the operating environment was rendered unviable. Here, the logic fractures again. If Venezuela's aluminum sector was inefficient, market forces would have replaced it with competitors. Instead, production capacity withered while reserves remained untouched, locked in place by infrastructure decay rather than geological exhaustion. This is not how commodities usually die. The deeper issue lies in how aluminum intersects with sovereignty. A country that controls its own bauxite to aluminum chain does not merely export raw material, it exports capability. And capability challenges dependency models built into global trade. The Guyana bauxite deposits represent a threshold. Below it, resource extraction as participation. Above it, industrialization as independence. Venezuela crossed that threshold once. It did not cross it again. Today, the plateaus remain. The ore remains. The hydroelectric potential remains. What does not remain is the permission to operate the system end-to-end without friction. Official narratives describe mismanagement. They do not explain why revival attempts trigger external resistance rather than support. The unresolved question is simple, and therefore unsettling. Why does a country rich enough to produce the metal that carries modern civilization find itself unable to activate that capacity, unless it accepts structural dependence as the price? The Guyana highlands offer no spectacle. They offer something more dangerous, the possibility that industrial independence is treated not as a development goal, but as a deviation to be corrected. The camera moves slowly across exposed rock faces. Not dramatic, not monumental, just old stone, fractured, oxidized, patient. These outcrops in southern Venezuela do not announce what they contain. They were never meant to. Rare earth elements do not exist as a single substance. They are scattered, diluted, difficult to isolate, and once isolated, they become indispensable. Neodymium for high-efficiency motors, dysprosium for heat-resistant magnets, lanthanum for optics and energy storage, cerium for polishing systems that shape the lenses of satellites and weapons alike. These elements do not power civilization, they tune it. Geological surveys across the Guyana Shield have repeatedly identified rare earth-bearing formations, lateritic crusts, carbonatite intrusions, and weathered alkaline complexes consistent with commercially viable deposits. None of this is speculative. The data exists. What does not exist is a coherent production narrative. Officially, Venezuela is not a rare earth producer. In practice, it sits atop formations that mirror those exploited aggressively elsewhere in the world. This absence is not accidental. Rare earths are not scarce because they are rare. They are scarce because separation is controlled. Processing requires chemical expertise, waste management tolerance, and long-term capital. Systems dominated by a small number of states that have accepted environmental and political costs, others are discouraged from bearing, which creates a paradox. The world demands diversification of rare earth supply, but it resists new entrants capable of operating independently. When Venezuela signaled interest in developing these deposits, attention followed briefly, then receded. No major technology transfer, no sustained investment, no integration into global value chains. Instead, the country faced increasing difficulty accessing the reagents, equipment, and financing required for separation and refinement. Once again, the pattern repeats. The official explanation points to instability and risk. But instability does not prevent exploration. It prevents autonomy. Because rare earths are not traded like oil or gold. They are embedded in defense contracts, industrial policy, and long-term strategic planning. A country that controls both extraction and processing, inserts itself into decisions it is not meant to influence. Southern Venezuela's rare earth potential sites precisely at that fault line. Developing it would not flood markets. It would dilute control. And control, in this domain, is non-negotiable. Today, references to Venezuelan rare earths appear occasionally in academic literature and internal policy assessments, never in export data. The deposits are acknowledged just enough to be categorized, but not enough to be activated. This is a resource state, unlike the others. It does not collapse economies when mismanaged. It collapses hierarchies when managed well. The unresolved question is not whether Venezuela can extract rare earth elements. It is whether the global system can tolerate another actor capable of doing so outside predefined alignments. Because rare earths define the pace and direction of technological evolution. Whoever controls them does not just supply the future. They decide who gets to build it. And in southern Venezuela, that decision has been postponed, not by geology, but by design. The final landscape is the oldest of all. Exposed bedrock. No vegetation tall enough to hide it. No movement except shadow. The Guayana Shield predates complex life, and within it lie materials that redefine what power means. Uranium and thorium are not energy sources in the conventional sense, they are thresholds. Their presence transforms geology into policy, and territory into liability. Unlike oil, gold, or industrial minerals, radioactive resources cannot be discussed openly without triggering surveillance, classification, and preemptive interpretation. In southern Venezuela, multiple geological surveys, some public, others fragmentary, have identified radioactive anomalies consistent with uranium and thorium-bearing formations, granitic intrusions, pegmatites, ancient sedimentary layers enriched through deep time. None of this is extraordinary in isolation. What is extraordinary is the silence that follows. Officially, Venezuela is not a uranium producer. Officially, no commercial nuclear program exists. And officially, there is nothing to see. Yet, restrictions on access to certain regions of the Guayana Shield intensified long before nuclear ambitions were ever articulated. Data from early surveys was never fully released. Subsequent references appear diluted, mentioned, then dismissed as non-viable or uneconomic without detailed justification. This is where the logic breaks completely. Uranium and thorium are not evaluated like other resources. They are evaluated by potential. A country does not need enrichment facilities to trigger concern. It needs geological credibility. Thorium, in particular, destabilizes assumptions. It promises nuclear energy without traditional fuel cycles, without weapons-grade byproducts, without dependence on existing enrichment regimes. In theory, it lowers the barrier to entry. In practice, it threatens the architecture of nuclear control. For a state already under strategic pressure, merely possessing such materials changes how it is perceived. Not because of what it has done, but because of what it could one day choose to do. And choice is the danger. This explains the pattern seen across decades. Silence instead of denial. Deflection instead of development. Classification instead of investment. The Guayana Shield's radioactive potential does not need to be activated to exert influence. Its existence alone is enough to invite scrutiny, containment, and preemptive isolation. The official narrative frames this as non-issue geology. But non-issues do not attract this level of caution. The unresolved question is not whether Venezuela will pursue nuclear capability. It is why the mere possibility has been treated as something to be managed long before it was ever proposed. Uranium and thorium complete the pattern established by every resource before them. Energy that cannot be controlled becomes forbidden. Autonomy that cannot be supervised becomes instability. Potential that cannot be aligned becomes a threat. In the Guiana Shield, the oldest rock on Earth holds the newest kind of power. And the final question is no longer about Venezuela. It is about a world in which access to fundamental energy thresholds is decided not by geology, but by permission. When viewed in isolation, each resource tells a familiar story. Oil that is too heavy, gold that never stabilizes, minerals that vanish into shadow, metals that fail to sustain industry, elements that remain perpetually potential, radioactive materials, spoken of only in fragments. But isolation is the comfort of official explanation. Reality emerges only when the seven are observed together. Across Venezuela, a single pattern repeats with unnerving consistency. Resources of ordinary value are extracted, exported, exhausted. Resources of strategic consequence are delayed, diluted, fragmented, or left dormant. Not because they are inaccessible, but because activating them would alter balance rather than participate in it. This is not coincidence. It is sequence. Each resource represents a different layer of power. Energy that reshapes markets. Gold that anchors sovereignty. Minerals that define technology. Metals that enable industrial independence. Elements that decide who builds the future. Materials that cross the final threshold of energy itself. Individually, they attract pressure. Together, they describe a nation positioned at a fault line the modern world prefers, remain inactive. The official narrative insists Venezuela is a cautionary tale of mismanagement. But mismanagement does not produce this level of structural consistency across unrelated sectors. Failure does not repeat with such precision. What we see instead is friction applied exactly where autonomy begins to form. This is not about punishment. It is about prevention. A world built on managed scarcity cannot tolerate uncontrolled abundance, especially when that abundance spans energy, industry, technology, and fundamental power sources simultaneously. Systems designed to regulate access respond not with open refusal, but with delay, fragmentation, and invisibility. And so Venezuela remains rich, but unusable, documented, but undeveloped, present, but strategically absent. The uncomfortable implication is that the crisis is not Venezuelan. It is systemic. Because if a country containing this spectrum of resources cannot activate them without destabilization, then development itself is conditional, not on capability, not on geology, but on alignment. The seven resources do not describe a curse. They describe a boundary between extraction and independence, between participation and autonomy, between being allowed to grow and being required to remain incomplete. This is not a story about the past. It is a warning about structure. Because there are boundaries humanity crossed too early, without agreeing who would be allowed to cross them fully. And once crossed, those boundaries do not disappear. They close.